Dear online course participants, welcome to this webinar organized within UNCTAD's online course on trade policy frameworks. My name is Ebru Gökçe Desmon. I'm an economic affairs officer at the trading systems section of the Division on International Trade and Commodities of UN Trade and Development. The online course on trade policy frameworks that we are currently running is the second of trade policy e-learning series. The first course was conducted last year around this time on trade impact assessments. Just to give you a heads up, our next trade policy online course will be on trade negotiations, theory and practice, again to be delivered by Dr. Craig van Grastek, who is with us today, the instructor of this current course. And the next course is scheduled for the period February-March 2025. So please keep an eye on the UNCTAD e-learning platform to have more information about this upcoming course. And I just want to give you some information on the participation in our current course. We are in the 8th week of the course, and there are currently over 450 registered participants from over 70 countries, mostly developing ones. We are doing good on gender balance, 48% female, 50% male, and 1.4% non-binary, and 3.7% persons with a disability. As for the professional profile of the participants, we have 54% from the public sector, 21% from private sector, 4% from civil society, and 16% from academia, including students, researchers, and faculty, and 4.7% UN staff. Concerning the participants' backgrounds, we have 37% economics, 18% law, 16% international relations, 3% political science, and 32% of participants have already taken an online course provided by UNCTAD. So at the end of this course, if you succeed in completing all the modules and passing successfully all the quizzes, you will be given a certificate signed by our director, Luz Maria de la Mora. There is one prerequisite, though, that to issue your personal certificate, and that's to complete the evaluation survey. Please do complete the survey. Your feedback is important for us. Now I'd like to invite Dr. Craig van Grastek, our course instructor and trade consultant since 1982, and adjunct lecturer at John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. According to The Economist, from January 2000, Craig keeps a sharp eye on the politics of trade. Craig received his PhD from Princeton University in 1997 and also holds degrees in international relations from Georgetown University and the University of Minnesota. And he has taught international relations at the American University, trade policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. Since 2000, he has been teaching there until present, and literature at Georgetown University. Yes, he did indeed. He wrote the official history of the World Trade Organization, published in 2013. And in 2019, Cambridge University Press published his book on trade and American leadership, The Paradoxes of Power and Wealth, from Alexander Hamilton to Donald Trump. Craig has 40 years of experience working with UNCTAD and many years of experience in advising developing countries to find the best ways to achieve their development goals. We thought that it would be interesting for us all to hear from a trade policy expert like Craig today about what we can expect from US trade policy post-election. So we asked him to address this issue, and he kindly accepted. Therefore, he will be deviating from the subject matter of this session in response to our request. And Craig will be picking up from the points he made in our first live introductory class session within this course regarding the different things that trade means to different countries and what this implies for the current US trade policy. Craig will also moderate the session. We have an excellent panel of experts here today. And we have also our director of the Trade Division, Luz Maria de la Mora, with us. So before I give the floor to Craig, I would like to acknowledge her presence. And Luzma, would you like to say a couple of words?
Sure. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Ebru, for putting together this seminar. But I also want to take this opportunity to thank tremendously deeply to express our deep gratitude to Professor Craig Van Graspek for accepting to talk about the evolving U.S. trade policy post-election. I have no doubt that this is an extremely timely issue for all of those of us who work on trade policy issues, especially as it regards to developing worlds and the developing world and development. I also would like to thank Dirk Bienen and Pierre Sauvé for their availability to speak in this webinar. I wish you all great session. We are really privileged to have Craig's presentation today, and we look forward to learning a lot from you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Edward. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Director, for your words. And without further ado, Craig, I give the floor to you now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the invitation, and certainly thank everyone for attending. Yes, I have often over the last 40 years or so, about every 4 years, someone asks me, what did the last election mean? And this time in particular, I think it is of special importance. So yes, we'll deviate a little bit from the subject matter that was advertised for this particular session. And I'll be doing this from a fairly high altitude. I noted that about 16% of you are in international relations, 3% political science. I am a political scientist, and I will be addressing this issue as a political scientist. So let me make a couple of caveats before I begin presenting the material. The first is, I think it's very important to stress, these are my opinions. These are my views on where the trading system is headed, where U.S. policy is headed. So don't mistake these in any way for the views of UNCTAD or any other international organization. But this is based upon my observation, not just of the last year or so, but also a book that I've been working on. As Ebru mentioned, my previous book was Trade and American Leadership. I wrote that in response to the first election of Donald Trump at a time when I was very concerned about what this might mean for U.S. policy and the trading system. About a year and a half ago, I started to be concerned about the writing on the wall and began writing another book, which I'm entitling The Power and Wealth of Nations, Trade Wars from Thucydides to Trump. And in this book, as in the last one, I am taking an historical view of where we are now, how we got here, trying to place trade wars in an overall structure in which I'm explaining the relationship between wealth and power and how it is that the position of the United States has changed so radically over time. And when you place these things in context and compare them to what has happened with previous great powers in the past, it begins to make sense. Now, what I will do is give you a very abbreviated summation of the main points that I'm going to be making in this book. I can't really predict whether I will use all or maybe a little bit more of the time I've been allocated, but in fairness to the other speakers, I'm going to try to reduce about 400 pages to about 20 minutes. We'll see how well I do on that. So I apologize in advance if I rush through the material, but at least it'll give you a sense of where I think we are headed, both in the United States and for the trading system as a whole, and how we got there. The main points. One, don't make too much specifically about Trump's election. Trump's election changes the pace, but not the direction that both U.S. policy and the system were already headed. As I previewed in the book that I wrote before on trade and American leadership, I come from a school of thought in political science that is called the theory of hegemonic stability. And the theory of hegemonic stability holds that the trading system, the structure of the trading system, the rule of law, the opportunities that are created for trade are largely a function of the global distribution of power and wealth, such that we tend to have relatively open markets if you have leadership that is provided by one country that has a strong interest in providing that leadership. And over time, if we have a decline in that willingness to provide leadership, the system itself can begin to deteriorate. So we've been seeing for decades that deterioration. It is accelerating tremendously under Trump, and we may see an almost cartoonish version of the argument that I'm going to be making here, but it does not depend entirely on Trump. Now, what we may soon see in the immediate future is stepped up use of market access as a foreign policy tool by the United States. You've been hearing Trump talk about this post-election. His go-to threat with any country is to say, if you don't do as we want on one issue or another, you're going to see 25% tariffs, 100% tariffs, and so forth. Trump is not unusual in that respect, although what makes him different from most previous US presidents is he directs those threats not according to the degree of friendliness of the country with which we are dealing, but rather the degree of that country's dependence. So you see him beating up as much on Canada as he does on China. US policy towards the WTO may go beyond quiet quitting. We have had the United States quiet quitting the WTO for over a decade already. In Trump's case, there's a question of whether we will actually see the United States depart from the WTO, in which case it becomes very much like the League of Nations did without the US participation, or if we simply have a continuation of quiet quitting, which is almost like being the League of Nations. We're going to see trade agreements that are built more around outcomes than opportunities. That is to say, dictating what the actual trade will be between countries rather than opening up market opportunities and allowing the market to decide what we're going to trade. And then finally, free trade agreements becoming more in the nature of exclusive blocks. One of the most important things that happened in the first Trump administration was the renegotiated NAFTA between the United States, Canada, and Mexico, in which Canada and Mexico were required to take on essentially the requirement that if they want to negotiate any free trade agreement with China, the United States will withdraw from the FTA with Mexico and or Canada. Over time, I think we're going to see both the United States and China making their FTAs exclusive blocks. And I think that is really the death knell of the system as we know it. Now, getting back to where we were in our very first presentation, those of you who were with us in our first class, you may remember that I was presenting data explaining how trade means different things to different countries, depending on relative imports and relative exports. So you may remember, if you were with us then, the countries that I chose here for illustrative purposes were the ones who I knew were going to be in the room, so to speak, because I saw who was going to be participating in that class. So Ethiopia, Niger, Pakistan, etc., all because those were countries from which we had at least 2 participants. Exports of goods and services relative to GDP. In the world as a whole, close to 1/3 of GDP is accounted for by exports of goods and services. But as you see, there's a tremendous difference between, say, Switzerland, where 3/4 of GDP is caught up in exports, and the United States, where it's 11%. Okay, so part of what I argue there is trade has a different level of impact on the economic opportunities of countries. And you may think of that as being an economic observation, but I want you to think about what that means politically. Now, compare that to another measure, which is countries' shares of global goods and services imports. That is to say, what share of total imports in the world are accounted for by any one country. And if you look at the United States, 1/8 of all the imports that are conducted in the world come into the United States. A little bit more than 1/10 go into China, and so forth. If you think about the relationship between these 2 measures of relative imports and relative exports, that is to say, exports relative to your own economy and your share of global imports, you can put them in a chart like this, which I did in our previous class. And again, the countries chosen here are the ones who are in the room. But what I think of these measures as is not as economic measures, but political measures, what I call market power and market exposure. Market power is that country's share of global imports. And I call it market power because a country is in a position to leverage that power by threatening another country. If you do not do as we say, we are going to cut off imports from you. Market exposure is the extent to which a country is dependent upon its access to foreign markets. And if you look at the numbers here, but then apply them to a political construct, you realize the farther a country moves along the line of market exposure, the more that trade is about trade. But the more that a country is to the left, the more trade may be about leverage. And the leverage is what shows up in this alternate measure of market power. The higher a country moves up this line, the more influence it may have over others. You put those two together, and this is sort of the essence of the argument that I make in the book, which is if you look at the great powers in the world, the great powers fall into one of three categories. Those countries that have high market power and low market exposure, I call political great powers. Those that have high market power and high market exposure, those are commercial great powers. There's also some great powers that have low market power and low market exposure. Those are the disengaged. And then the countries that I call exposed have both low market power and high market exposure. Great powers don't fall in that category. I won't talk now about the disengaged great powers because that's not what's at issue today, although historically, if you look at Sparta, if you look at the Soviet Union, if you look at Nazi Germany, these are great powers that were disengaged. They tried to make themselves less dependent on foreign trade. The real distinction now is between political great powers and commercial great powers. And the way that the world is different today versus where we were in British hegemony is the British were a commercial great power. They did not want to use their market. They did not want to weaponize access to their market because it would hurt them economically because they were so dependent on exports. And what I find fascinating and most important about the current conflict between the United States and China, but between the rivalry between these two great powers, is that they are both political great powers. Neither is a commercial great power. This is not what we anticipated a generation ago. A generation ago, we thought that China was becoming a commercial great power. But I'll give you some data to show how that has not happened. Now, I won't go through this in any length because our time is quite limited, but just to be aware, a lot of my book is devoted to an examination historically of the different types of conflicts we have had over time between the three different types of great powers. So don't believe anyone who tells you that the more that countries trade, the more peaceful the world is going to be. In fact, what we find is the more that countries trade, the more that their conflicts may be about trade. And the more that countries are independent of trade, the more they may want to leverage that fact with respect to the countries with which they deal. But the fact is that great powers of all varieties engage in conflicts with other great powers, and the place of trade within the economic, military, political constructs of those countries affects how they use trade, but it does not prevent them from engaging in conflict. So if you want to see commercial great powers fighting one another, look at the Byzantine Empire versus the Sasanian Persians, look at the United Kingdom versus the Netherlands, look at the United Kingdom versus Wilhelmine Germany and what led up to World War I. Commercial great powers fight one another. You can see examples of political versus commercial powers, Rome versus Carthage. You can see examples of disengaged versus commercial powers, Sparta versus Athens. One thing that is relatively rare historically is a political great power versus another political great power, but that's what we have in the case of the United States versus China. These are both political great powers. And remember, because they are political great powers, it is within their capacity to weaponize access to their markets at relatively little cost to themselves. And so it's a natural thing to expect them to make commercial conflict be a major part both of how they deal with one another, but more importantly, how they deal with third parties. And so there's one way in which the current conflict is very different from the Cold War, and another way in which it's very similar to the Cold War. The difference is the Soviet Union was a disengaged great power, and so commercial conflict did not take place between the United States and the Soviet Union. But there was a lot of conflict at the periphery. That is to say, each side was trying to get other countries to side with them in the Cold War. And that's the way in which the conflict between the United States and China is similar to the Cold War, is at the periphery, each side is trying to attract allies, and those allies are attracted in part through the negotiation of free trade agreements. In the world today, we have 10 great powers, or at least what I count as 10 great powers. We have the two contenders for hegemony. We have the United States and China. We have 4 global great powers and 4 regional great powers. And what I find most fascinating about the world today is there's only one commercial great power left, and that's Germany. I count, by the way, Germany as a great power and not the European Union. The European Union does not have a military of its own. The size of these circles that you see here is military spending, and the United States is the index, and each other circle is as large as the relative amount of military spending. So China, you can see, is getting larger, but is not yet at the level of spending of the United States. What's fascinating is Germany is our only commercial great power that is left. Both of the contenders for hegemony are political great powers, and all of the other great powers, the 4 regional great powers and the 3 remaining global great powers, are in a sort of limbo zone where they're neither fully exposed nor they are not commercial great powers, nor are they disengaged. They have relatively low level of interest. If you compare them to the global average, the average country in the world, 46% of its GDP is tied up in exports. For the average great power, it's 26%. So none of these countries have a very strong incentive to restore the very weakened, the very diminished global trading system. All of them, with the exception of Germany, have an interest in treating trade as an issue other than trade. So how did we get here? The United States used to be in a conflict with Japan, and the US-Japanese conflict of the 1970s through the 1990s was a dress rehearsal for where we end up in the conflict with China. One of the main reasons that over time the United States came to withdraw from support of the multilateral system is in part because it saw the challenge from Japan, which was, in retrospect, tremendously exaggerated. The challenge that was perceived from Japan led the United States to take a number of steps that over time have changed the approach we take to trade policy. One was the adoption of reciprocity as a policy. That is to say, threatening another country with the imposition of penalty duties if that country does not abide by what the United States thinks ought to be correct policy. So we had a number of confrontations with Japan especially in the 80s and the 90s, not realizing at the time that in fact Japan was going to be a diminishing power over time. As you can see, comparing 1975 with 90, 2005, and 2020, Japan did increase its market power for a short while, but its market power has rapidly declined. And what the United States did not anticipate was the real challenge was going to be with China. And China appeared around the turn of the century to be a country that was en route to becoming the second commercial great power. That is to say, up until about 2005, the expectation was that China would be like Germany. China was acquiring not only increased market power, but increased market exposure. And there was a critical change that took place early in this century, where China began to emphasize not the external sector as the engine of growth, but rather the domestic economy as the engine of growth. And what we saw was Chinese market power has increased over time, but Chinese market exposure, which had been veering in the German direction, is now veering in the US direction. So there has been relatively little change over time in the market power of the United States or the market exposure of the United States, but there's been tremendous change in China, such that the strategy of engagement that was being pursued at the time of opening up China and extending most favored nation treatment to China and negotiating for China's accession to the WTO, all of this was done in a hopeful environment where it was thought that China was becoming a very supportive partner in the trading system. But instead, what has happened is China is approaching the position of the United States, both with respect to market exposure and market power, when there's increasing concerns in the United States over US competitiveness, and China is growing tremendously in its military spending, again, approaching that level of the United States. And the same things that were being pioneered in the US conflict with Japan, reciprocity laws, the negotiation of free trade agreements, demands for managed trade, all of those instruments are being redirected in dealing with China. And my point, getting back to where I began, is all of this was already underway before Trump showed up, but it receives greater energy and greater urgency in the second Trump term, which I expect to be much like the first Trump term, but on steroids. So actually, I was wondering if I would stick to about 20 minutes. I did. So that is about 400 pages of analysis reduced to 20 minutes. I hope I haven't lost you in the presentation. We are going to change gears and turn to the discussion of the subject matter for today, with a series of 4 speakers, but then we will have a period of Q&A. So if people have any questions they want to pose to me, based on the presentation that I made, we can do it at that time. But I'm going to turn now to the other speakers, and just to warn them all in advance, I'll use my very high-tech system. I counted myself 20 minutes using my 20-minute timer here. I have a 10-minute timer for Pierre, to whom I will turn now. Pierre Sauvé is an old friend of mine. We've been working on trade issues together since the time that he was at the OECD in the 1990s. He is now in the Geneva office of the World Bank in the Trade and Regional Integration team. Pierre, so as not to take more of your time by the introduction, let me just turn the floor over to you and spin the timer upside down.
Thank you, Craig. Can you hear me all?
Yes.
Well, thanks a lot. I mean, I feel we're going from the sublime to the ridiculous. This was an extremely rich presentation you made. I really look forward to reading the book. And I have already so many questions to ask you. And I was wondering, just one very quick one, where would you put technology in the realm of factors that come into play? Are they political or are they commercial? Technology seems to be very much at the core of the rivalry between US and China, the quest for technological supremacy in frontier technologies. And it also coincides with another factor that you didn't really mention, but it's implicit in much of what you said, which is the timing of the spurt or the rise in rivalry, which tends to coincide with a decline in the relative share of the previous hegemon. And we see this very much at play. The US engagement in multilateral, its willingness to cooperate, its willingness to tolerate free riding, ebbing as its ability to, command and dominate the global conversation on economic governance has progressively ebbed over time. So I'm curious to see how these factors play out in your analysis. Probably you didn't present everything, but these are very, very interesting insights, and I thank you for that. So as I said, we're going to go from the sublime to the ridiculous, and my focus in what I'm going to present you is really to talk a bit about services and the role that services plays in the evolution of global trade governance. And I start with recalling something that I always find important to tell my students, and that is trade is not an end in itself. Trade negotiators tend to think that it is, but it's a means to an end. And of course, working as I do for a development institution, the World Bank, that end typically is employment, it's jobs. The biggest challenge we face in development is producing productive employment for very large and growing cohorts of young people, of young workers with an increasingly high level of skills. And the question you have to ask yourself is, where are those jobs being created? And this graph paints a very telling picture of what's been happening to employment over long periods of time over the last 3 decades. And what we see, and this should not surprise anyone who pays attention to these trends, is a dramatic decline in the relative share of employment in agriculture as agriculture becomes much more productive thanks to technology and fertilizer use and mechanization. Where do those jobs go? They go almost exclusively towards services. They don't go much towards industry. And we see that over time, much of the decline in agriculture is made up by a rising propensity for employment to concentrate in tertiary activities. Jobs in industry are very stable. They're growing a bit, of course, in the developing world, which is catching up, but not by much. And again, why? Because technology essentially produces jobless growth in manufacturing. We replace people by robots whenever we can. Robots are highly productive. Robots never go on strike. Robots all love their bosses. They don't form unions. And the propensity for employers, for firms, including firms that are large in trading, is to substitute labor with capital and to automate whenever that's possible. So we have this, this dilemma of job creation increasingly being in services and putting very significant challenges to countries who, think about their growth prospects. Another trend that I find very revealing is, there is a very strong attraction to manufacturing and to industry and to industrialization as somehow the most appealing vector of growth and development. I would even say almost industrialization sort of fetishism. We see that in the United States. MAGA is very much about bringing back those jobs in manufacturing and industry, but we see that also in a lot of developing countries who seem to assign to industrialization a really central place in development priorities. And yet, if you look at the numbers, what you see is that, the amount of emerging and developing countries who are growing fastest thanks to manufacturing export-led growth, has really declined very precipitously over the last few decades. Manufacturing used to be, for many developing countries, a center of gravity for growth, but it isn't today. And we see a drop by a factor of between 3 and 4 in the likelihood that manufacturing-led growth is going to be the road to export success. Then what we see is that actually almost the reverse is true in services. Not as great, but between 1/2 and 3/4 growth in the number of developing countries whose main engine of growth has been the service economy, has been services export. So we see some very significant changes in the texture of what is driving trade growth, what is driving job creation, what is driving income generation, and it belies, the sort of priority focus that a lot of countries keep placing on industrialization. And it recalls sort of, very antiquated. This will speak to Craig's roots as a historian, the physiocrats who tended to assign to agriculture, the central role in wealth creation. And we had to specialize in agriculture and agricultural production and agricultural trade and land ownership. That was more virtuous than industry. And of course, we never spoke about services at the time. But we are in a bit of the same place here, where we tend to think that somehow the service economy, services production, services trade is less dynamic, is less virtuous somehow than industrialization, that we should really focus primarily, first and foremost, on pursuing industrial strategies and therefore deploying industrial policies towards that end. But again, the facts tell a different story. If we look at the sort of compound annual growth rate of exports of goods and different types of services, what you see is that, with the exception of transport, every major category of services exports has way exceeded the growth of goods trade over the last 2 decades. So there are some very profound changes occurring in the very texture of the world economy, to which perhaps we should be paying more attention than governments seem to be paying in international discussions. And those trends also here, so far, I've been focusing mostly on emerging and middle-income countries. But even if you go down the income ladder and look at the least developed countries, you find a very surprising piece of evidence that even if from a low base, LDCs are still not exporting enough services, of course, they account for less than 1% of world services trade. But the growth of their services exports, including services delivered through digital means, exceeds the world average by quite some margin and is higher than that of other developing countries. And so I found this statistic extremely revealing, that the share of LDCs where services is the leading growth driver has more than doubled in the last 30 years. It used to be that 2 out of every 5 LDCs were driven by services growth, mostly tourism. Today, it's close to 80% of LDCs whose main driver of growth is the service economy. And the basket of services that is driving that growth is today much broader than it used to be. It used to be essentially a tourism story and a bit of a transport story. But now, thanks to digitization, a lot of developing countries, including poorer ones, are very significantly diversifying their export baskets in services. So what conclusions do I draw from this very brief presentation? One is that we need to be mindful of the very significant changes that are occurring in the very texture of the world economy and in the structure of trade that results from sort of competing forces of fragmentation, forces of deglobalization, increasing skepticism about the virtues of liberalization, of trade liberalization, but also the very powerful impacts that technology is exerting on all of these phenomena. Second conclusion is there's no denying that we are in a period of a sort of nostalgic yearning for the return of jobs in manufacturing. And that nostalgia, I think, fuels a very strong interest in deploying industrial policy tools with a view to specializing in manufacturing. In some developed countries, none more so than the United States, this has reached almost a level of fetishism, but in many developing countries, it's also renewing interest in import substitution means of industrialization in a world economy in which the scope for import substitution, liberalization, industrialization is very, very different, simply because we are in a world of cross-border production networks. My third observation is that the world economy is very unkind towards industrial latecomers. If you happen to be small, if you happen to have not terribly good geography, if you don't have means for scale, it's going to be one big challenge to industrialize and to use manufacturing-led growth as your engine of development. We see that time and again. Industry Industrialization tends to be highly concentrated. The big sectors are increasingly concentrated, and they're concentrated in the hands of countries that have either sufficient market size or the geographical attributes, proximity to large markets, proximity to the sea, that make a difference. And so a lot of developing countries simply don't have those attributes, and they're going to have to start to think harder about alternatives, including the alternative of services. And they can do so also in the context of the greatest existential threat that we face as a species, humanity, and that is the threat of climate change and the need to both mitigate and adapt to it. And so services are going to be central to the green transition and to the transition towards a more service-centric world economy. Of essence is going to be an economy with a much lighter ecological footprint. So, the focus on services is a necessity, it seems to me, for many developing countries. All the more so because services require significantly less capital than manufacturing does, less scale. It tends to favor smaller firms, and it also has very, very strong attributes of inclusiveness, particularly for women and young workers and entrepreneurs. So the service economy is also a gateway for a more inclusive growth pattern. I'm going to just finish on one paradox, which baffles me, someone who's been working on trade and services for several decades, and that is, why does a sector of such importance, both as a sector in its own right, but also as an intermediate, as an input into the production of other goods and services, why does it not garner greater traction in international negotiations? And I think this poses some real problems of trade policy formulation, the sheer diversity of the service economy, the multiplicity of market failures to which regulation needs to respond, the sheer intensity of domestic regulatory activity, the vertical nature of the ministries that regulate and who don't talk to each other. These are all very big challenges in trade policy formulation, which perhaps explains why countries don't have in services the kinds of strategies that really cater both to evolving sources of comparative advantage, but also sensitivity to the economy-wide importance of tackling the sector. So I hope we're going to be able to talk a bit about trade policy frameworks and how they need to be improved and strengthened, including through the kind of trade capacity building that UNCTAD provides, in addressing a growth juggernaut that I think remains to be fully exploited. Let me stop there.
All right. Thank you very much, Pierre. We're now going to turn to Dr. Dirk Bienen. Dr. Bienen has his PhD in economics from the University of Göttingen. He is the managing partner at BKP Economic Advisors and has a very impressive background in both North-North and North-South negotiations, having been involved in EU negotiations with Vietnam, Australia, New Zealand, Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and the Southern African Development Community. So, Dr. Bienen, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Craig. Yeah, maybe just a very brief response to Pierre's presentation just now. Why is the services so kind of under negotiated? Why doesn't it get the traction? I think one of the main reasons is that we're talking about domestic regulation, and in an era where countries are increasingly unwilling to give up sovereignty, and whether there's a general unwillingness to cooperate, I don't think that we'll see much more traction coming up. I found Craig's presentation quite fascinating and very systematic. Actually, it aligns very well with kind of what I've been thinking based on observations from dealing with the European Commission and also developing countries, and how trade is is working, how trade policy has been working, and what kind of the overall state of the global environment has been. I was just a bit puzzled about the notion that Germany is the commercial great power because the EU has no military. I would argue that Germany doesn't have much of a functioning military either. So that is maybe something that we should keep in mind. When it comes to the topic of this webinar, emerging issues in trade policy formulation and implementation, I thought when being asked for it, oh God, I mean, it's such a broad topic, and then a 10-minute presentation. So what you do? So these days, well, what you do is you ask AI to provide a brief summary, kind of what is the state of trade and trade policy these days. And so I asked, and that's kind of the picture that I got. The end is here. So the whole kind of global framework for trade and trade policy, as we know it, is gone, has changed, and Craig has already explained quite a bit of the background for that. So I just wanted to say, based on my kind of inductive approach, impressionistic approach, what my observations on that were. So the first one is kind of this trade policy no longer being for the sake of trade policy, but having become subjected increasingly to other policy objectives, and here specifically national security interests in many countries. And that does not only apply to the kind of two contenders for hegemony, the US and China, but it applies to the EU, Russia, many developing countries as well. When you see the extent to which trade policy has become subjected to requirements on import and export controls, foreign direct investment controls, linking trade policy to migration issues in the EU, for example. There are many examples why trade policy's nature has changed away from kind of the commercial economic aspects and being subjected to geopolitical considerations. A related trend to that is that violations of the multilateral trade rules have become increasingly frequent and increasingly blatant. Of course, being led by some of the major powers, but in the shadow of those, you also see many developing countries flouting the rules, just not, you know, taking unilateral trade policy decisions that are at odds with the multilateral rules, and nothing is really happening. And that, of course, leads to an increasing erosion of the multilateral trading systems rules. And we see a unilateralization of trade policies. Tariffs, for decades, we said, okay, we saw that tariffs were going down on average. Now that has leveled out. You don't see really globally a pickup in tariffs, average tariffs globally. But I guess with the upcoming administration in the US, and then the responses, policy responses that we'll certainly see from other countries, that is going to be changing. And that also means that, I mean, for decades, we have been saying, okay, forget about tariffs, you know, that is basically a thing of the past. Now we have to look into non-tariff issues. But that, again, is being put on its head. And we have to think about tariff policies and kind of old-fashioned market access issues, again, which are becoming or have become much more important trade policy instruments. And finally, what I find a bit puzzling is that when you look at the negotiations at the WTO and multilateral fora, and the negotiations taking place, it's almost as if you're witnessing kind of the emperor's new clothes. I mean, negotiations proceed as if nothing happened, as if the system was in a healthy state, when clearly it is not. So what are the trade policy responses to this to these fundamental changes in the trading environment? Now, the question that was asked to us by the organizers of the seminar is what kind of trade policy is needed to contribute to sustainable and inclusive development in the context of increasing importance of services, global value change, new industrial policy trends, etc. What I found here is a bit this normative approach, framing trade policy still in the framework of sustainable and inclusive development, which also is crumbling at the edges in times of the geopolitical tension. So I would like to go one step back and be a bit more neutral in the question. So what kind of trade policy do we want? And here I think what we used to have like a normative approach whereby trade policy was an instrument for pursuit of the global good, but then also a positive approach to trade policy, like the interest-driven approach. And that until quite recently, until we saw the pickup of the geopolitical situation that we're facing now, there was quite a bit of overlap, but that is no longer the case, right? So I think this normative approach, which was also behind the question that we've been asked to respond to, sustainable development, inclusive development, and the positivistic approach where trade policy is an element of power politics, they have become quite apart. Now, that is not a very helpful conclusion for the formulation of trade policy, but it is something that maybe as trade policymakers, we should have at the back of our mind what are we actually trying to achieve? What is the ultimate purpose of trade policy? I guess that's for each probably above most, if not all, our pay grades. But even at a technical level, when it comes to devising trade policy specific tools, it might be useful to keep that in mind. On a more practical matter, what does trade policy? How should trade policy respond to these global fundamental changes? I think with the retreat of the multilateral level, and that also ties in with what Craig said, that FTA is becoming exclusive clubs. Countries are well advised to prioritize their negotiations, their trading relationships with key partners. But that, of course, bears the question, who are the key partners? And I would say that there are two types of key partners. One is the important markets. So that is the countries to which the exports of my country are exposed. If a large share of Germany's exports go to China, then obviously China is a key partner. And the same would go, well, basically for any country, whatever country you're representing, you have to find who are the most important markets. So that's the economic aspect. But then the geopolitical aspect also comes in, like-minded countries. Which countries are in my camp, which are, share political interests and so forth. And that is the instrumental role of trade policy as a broader political instrument. Well, once you know who the key partners are, it has to be identified what should be the key issues for the trade policy at the negotiation. Oh, my time is up. So market access issues are becoming increasingly important again, and that one issue there is the re-emergence of tariff preferences. But it goes beyond that. When you are negotiating with specific partners, one or several, then the industrial policy, which domestically has made its reappearance already anyways, also becomes an issue for trade policy formulation. So you might want to discuss issues around joint production. And for the EU, for example, when you think about the critical raw materials agreements that are being negotiated, there are win-win situations where the EU wants to have access to these critical raw materials, and the countries that have the deposits of the critical raw materials, they do not only want to export the raw materials, so they want to have the jobs creation, as Pierre mentioned. So that opens up avenues for trade policies going into kind of industrial policy and negotiating kind of these cooperation agreements for joint production, for example. In the area of agriculture and food production, think about cooperation on quality infrastructure. So it's not only tariffs and market access, it's also about kind of negotiating and prior to that, formulating strategies for non-tariff trade policy issues. So that is negotiations with the key partners, but where's the multilateral kind of level? Where's that left? And I would say kind of it has been relegated a bit because of the sorry state of the WTO, where kind of dispute resolution is no longer functioning, rules are being flouted. That doesn't mean that the multilateral level has become obsolete, but it's kind of relegated to a kind of secondary nature. It is important to remain in touch, to keep, keep having a floor on which negotiations with the key trading partners can be done. So maybe two conclusions that I'm drawing from this whole thing. One is that trade policy is becoming more resource intensive. As you are dealing with many more relationships, policy relationships with individual partners, obviously the resources that consumes, if you have 10 negotiations with 10 different partners going on at the same time, that is more resource consuming than having the multilateral level negotiations. So trade policy, although it has become less important as a policy instrument, has become more important or more resource consuming. And that is something that will have to be taken domestically into account by providing the requisite resources so that meaningful trade policy formulation in the new environment can take place. On the other hand, this new fragmentation and the fragmentation of trade relations and trade negotiations also opens up new opportunities for trade and economic diversification. So altogether, I would say kind of times are risky, but risky times also mean high opportunities. So yeah, I asked AI again what all this means, and the outlook is kind of slightly positive. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Vahini Naidu, who has an outstanding record in representing South Africa in various regional and multilateral sites, including South Africa's permanent mission to the WTO and being focal point and coordinator for the African group in the WTO. She is now the program coordinator of the Trade and Development Program of the South Center. So, Vahini, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And firstly, let me just start by thanking the organizers, but also you, Professor. That was really a very fascinating presentation. And an African proverb had come to mind when you were presenting, and it goes like, when the elephants fight, it is the grass that suffers. And it basically means, that when these powerful forces go to war, it's really the people who get hurt, or those who never really asked for conflict in the first place are the ones that are caught in the crossfire. And I thought it was also interesting that you had pointed out the 8 powers, and I think that's why it's good that maybe South Center is represented, to kind of give a bit more of a developing country perspective, because there's another 130 countries to account for. I think a lot of countries are going to be caught in this crossfire. And we should be expecting some degree of patience as we see a lot of things unfold in the US, but also globally. So my first point that I wanted to make is that I think just taking on from you, Professor, about the trajectory and the expectations, and judging from what has happened historically, I just want to add that, coupled with the persistent asymmetries in the global trading system will be the marginalization of developing countries. This increasing shift towards unilateralism and protectionism, which was also mentioned by the previous speaker, also represents a really, really big challenge to the rules-based system. And this kind of rebellion against established norms, it's not only going to undermine the principles of global cooperation, but it will also place disproportionate burdens on developing countries who traditionally rely on a stable and predictable framework for their integration. And a thought came to mind that if developed countries continue to deviate from the principles of the rules-based system, then it becomes increasingly difficult to justify why developing countries should also not do the same, or why they should also not adopt policies that prioritize their own development needs and objectives. And I guess in this context, it's only reasonable for developing countries to explore industrial policies and strategies that also focus on fostering their own domestic industries and having more of an inward-oriented kind of development approach, while also remaining open to meaningful and equitable cooperation. I should also add that with the US, it's been really interesting. And of course, without, the issue of them potentially violating WTO rules, I think for the first time, developing countries in a way are also meeting in the middle. I can just give you a quick anecdote. In the MC13 negotiations, there was a green room meeting in Abu Dhabi, and the African group were negotiating language on establishing a working group on industrial policy in the WTO. And I think some of the language that they were negotiating was about the need for industrial policy space for developing countries. And the US in the negotiation said, we'll accept this if you just remove developing countries. So it's quite interesting, to see this shift. And I think kind of touching on what Professor Sauvé was also saying about industrial policy, I mean, I think I have a bit of a nuanced perspective that industrial policy is, of course, essential for development. And this is really what history, economic literature shows us, because it lays the foundation for structural transformation, economic diversification, job creation, which I think is less achievable through a services-focused approach alone. And that I know, services, of course, are extremely important, especially in the digital era, but they often complement rather than replace the transformative potential of industrialization. And I think here maybe we need to be considering a balanced strategy that prioritizes industrialization while also fostering high-value services to maximize development outcomes. Now, more specifically, when we talk about sustainable and inclusive development, I mean, we have to talk about structural transformation, diversification, what is needed for most developing countries who are exporters of primary raw materials. And it's well documented what, the kind of holy grail of policy tools would include, like infant industry protection, targeted subsidies, incentives, green technologies, incentivizing local production. But particularly in the area of CRM, maybe developing countries can also consider implementing measures to encourage local value addition to raw materials by adopting policies that incentivize domestic processing and industrial upgrading, such as export duties or other regulations, but aligned with WTO provisions to enhance economic diversification and also to create jobs. And I think these measures could be designed in a transparent way and also applied in a manner that is consistent with WTO rules. And finally, my last point is really on the kind of issues we can expect to see with respect to the CBAM. We note that the deforestation, for instance, the deforestation regulations has been delayed. And here, in terms of like mitigating some of the risks, I think one of the low-hanging fruits, potentially, as we talk about inclusive and sustainable development with the trade policy, is the notion of the development of guidelines with respect to trade-related environmental measures. And here, I just thought it was kind of like a low-hanging fruit to consider, because the African group, which comprises of 45 WTO members, but also separately, Colombia have also tabled proposals in the WTO to develop these kinds of environmental measures. Maybe this is one way in which UNCTAD and other colleagues could be supporting these countries, but also the idea that the WTO could be a place where these discussions could take place and where more transparent guidelines and more non-discriminatory guidelines could really help many, many countries as they have to deal with these emerging trade policy challenges. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Very well appreciated points. Our last speaker is my good friend Taisuke Ito. Tai is the chief of the Trading Systems section in the Division of International Trade and Commodities at UNCTAD. He also serves as the focal point for the global system of trade preferences among developing countries. I'm happy to say I've known Tai for a number of years, and we've been on mission in quite a number of countries together. So Tai, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Craig. Well, thank you very much for all the speakers. Up until now, I think we are having very good discussion. In my presentation, I'm going to talk about trade preferences. Okay. So this is the kind of traditional instruments of trade policy. You know, this is about preferential tariffs. So as Dirk said, tariff may be back. But we thought, you know, these instruments were developed in the 1960s and 1970s, especially in the context of UNCTAD as well. So I think this is a good moment to look back and, you know, examine what has been the achievement or not of non-reciprocal trade preferences, and see how this may be adapted going forward in the future. Of course, so this is based on our publication, you know, which is called Trade Preferences Outlook 2024, which we just published this year. You know, of course, we prepared this, you know, throughout the last year, and then, you know, this was before the US election, so we didn't think about this, you know, coming back with tariff issues. But so this may be, you know, there may be some changes in terms of, you know, significance of this topic in general. But I think the overall change in the international economic scene and trading system is, you know, this remains the case. So this is if we look back this unilateral trade preferences that was you know, developed 1970s and 60s and 70s, where the initial idea was to, you know, to address the commodity dependence of, you know, the developing country, which was just became independent at the time. And the idea behind this GSP scheme, which was elaborated within UNCTAD, was that by opening up large developed country market, countries tried to support developing countries' exports to large developed country market. So at the time, developed country had a high tariff still in place because that was the before WTO era. So there was no monetary trading liberalization has taken place yet. So there was a case kind of to unilaterally open up the markets to support developed countries' exports to, especially to support industrialization. But I think at the time there was some limits in terms of design of the schemes, and extent of liberalization was not effective enough. But since then, over the last 20, 30 years, there's been general improvements in the scheme of different countries in terms of GSP and other initiatives, because there was the product coverage, and then just in the context of duty-free quota-free market access initiative in the 2000s, around 2000, there's been significant improvements in the market access condition for LDCs, and now the LDCs have 100% coverage in terms of product coverage, and then it's duty-free. And also rules of origin has been also reformed, and then most recently, and especially in the EU and Canada and several donors countries, there's been this graduation of high-income countries and upper middle-income countries from the scheme. So the idea behind it is to support more LDCs by focusing preferential access to those countries. So given those improvements, what has been the situation now? So this was the kind of question we want to address in this report, and we saw that one of the findings of the report is that the scope of tariff preference is getting smaller and smaller over the past decades, making preference less effective and more and more difficult to use. So this is because one reason, of course, is the multilateral trade liberalization that was conducted under WTO, got UGA round. As a result of the UGA round, there was MFN market liberalization. Also, because of proliferation of regional trade agreements, applied rates also declined, as you can see in this graph, on the upper side of the graph. And so this has resulted in LDCs, which are major beneficiaries of preferences, to have only 5% of preference margin as compared to MFN. So this is still sizable, but still, if you compare this with the applied rates, which other developing countries are facing in a given market like EU or US, so the difference is only 1%. So LDC, not even if they have some preference margin available, they are not, receive the significant competitive advantages. So this means the margin of preference is getting lower and lower. And then if you have only small margin of preferences, then what happens is that countries cannot really use tariff preferences available. So this has been especially the case for non-LDCs, because non-LDCs have a little, they receive normally the less beneficial preferences in the different GSP schemes and so on. And also, when there is the RTAs available, they tend to use available regional trade agreements, and also because of the global value chain trade, nowadays you need to import to be able to export the products. So that makes it difficult to comply with the rules of origin. And also, in the meantime, there's been the tariffs are becoming less and less important in terms of trade cost, and NTMs, non-tariff measures, are becoming more and more important, like SPS activity measures. So these are a more constraining factor for developing countries' exports. And also, during this, in the modern trade, the trade competitiveness is not driven by only cheap labor or natural resources, but more about its productive capacity and FDIs and technology and services, which were mentioned by the previous speakers. So those are the more important component trade costs and also the source of competitiveness. So therefore, we want to see what's the future of trade preferences today, and also what else can we do to promote developing countries' export in the current context. So in terms of tariff, preference tariffs, there are some technical maybe improvements which we can think about by improving the utilization, by facilitating rules of origin reforms, and also maybe improving transparency, especially that's the case for LDC. But when it comes to non-LDCs, it's very difficult to see how their benefits can be improved under the GSP scheme, but because many donors are shifted to LDCs, and there's a little scope. And if you try to improve market access conditions for non-LDCs, that would directly affect LDC preferences. So it's very difficult trade-offs between expanding benefits to LDC vis-a-vis non-LDCs. But one thing we can think about is maybe the one of the key challenges for non-reciprocal preferences is that they are uncoordinated measures. So these are the measures implemented by individual countries to by their own schemes. So that creates diversity in the regulation. So that one way of improvement is maybe to harmonize or coordinate at least the different regulations so that the countries can use this countries can export under the similar conditions to different markets like EU or US and Canada, if possible. That's one way of the improvements, and where I think the UNCTAD used to play a very important role because as we provide a platform for discussion among donors to coordinate some of the preferential tariffs and rules of origin issues. So that maybe can be considered, and there may be some lessons to be learned from the past experience. And then I think going forward, I think the tariffs becoming less and less important. The other source of competitiveness is getting more important, and so in that sense, what else can we do in terms by donor countries? What can donor countries offer to developing countries to facilitate their trade? So one, I think the promising area is non-tariff measures because non-tariff measures is becoming more constraining for developing country exporters. But we know, as Dirk and some other speakers mentioned, it's the regulatory measures. So you cannot actually provide preferences to LDC, for instance. So what is maybe useful is maybe to address capacity constraints, for exporting countries to meet the standards in developed country market. And there is some provisions in the WTO arguments, and so that can be kind of provide a basis to argue for more enhanced capacity building measures to support LDC exports. And when it comes to services, as Mrs. Sobe mentioned, services is getting a very promising area. And then in the WTO context, there was attempts to create LDC service waiver, which is in place. And this may be we are wondering if this can be a basis for kind of GSP for services. I mean, if this can provide a useful avenue for LDC exports, that may be one area of consideration. And also industrial policy, as Vahini and also Dirk mentioned, this can be a very interesting areas. And for instance, we are thinking whether US can provide more, create demand by including, for instance, tax credits for those EVs which uses inputs from the AGOA country, for instance. That may be the one option or one possible avenue for adapting the preference to the current situations. And also we looked at some few areas. One is investment. Donor countries often provide outward FDI promotional activities, but this can be somehow tied to preferential market access conditions. So that's one consideration. And also technology, as Mr. Sobe mentions, technology is a key determinant of current today's trade competitiveness. And in WTO context, again, there's this issue of providing incentives for technology transfer to LDC. So is there any way we can tie this kind of initiative to preferential market access condition that may be useful? That's what we thought about. And then lastly, market access has been provided to LDCs, but always issue is product capacity and supply side constraints, and that hinder these countries' market access conditions. So there is a case of ACP EU past experience, but if today in the current context, if we could the link aid for trade initiative to this preferential market access conditions, or also addressing trade finance, which has appeared to be the major constraining factor for LDC exports. So those are in a nutshell our thinking and the question we raised in the report. So there are lots of questions rather than answers. So I think it's we want to put these ideas to the for the consideration of the readers and discussion here. And of course, tariff is back, and as Dirk mentions, we thought about this kind of new areas of cooperation, but still maybe since tariff is back, there is still room for improvements in terms of preferential tariff as well. So let me stop here. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you very much, Kai. Excellent presentation on a very well-written report. I enjoyed reading it myself. Very good. We have had our presentations. Ebru, are we turning to Q&A?
Yes, Craig. Sorry, yes. There's a question in the Q&A addressed to you, actually. If you want to take it.
It's not in the chat, is it?
It's not in the chat, it's in the Q&A. You click on more
I
at
see.
the
There we
end of
go.
that bar, and then you will see.
And then I see. All right.
Okay.
I'm not seeing any question, however. It brings up a blank screen. Whoever has the question, can we just turn the floor over to them? Because when I look at welcome to Q&A, it's asking me if I have a question.
Oh, okay. Maybe it's sent to me only, if it's not sent to everyone.
Right, I'm not seeing anything.
I can read it.
Go ahead.
So, what are thoughts on the recent comments by Trump to impose tariffs on all products coming into the United States from Canada, Mexico, and China, versus China's recent ban on exports of some critical minerals to the United States in an apparent countermeasure?
Yes, absolutely. That latter part, I believe, was just announced yesterday. Very clearly, different countries are positioning themselves for dealing with the incoming administration, and the contrast, as I suggested in my comments, between Canada and China is particularly useful. As I said before, the Trump administration seems to be directing its threats as much according to another country's dependency on access to the U.S. market as it is on the degree of conflict between the United States and that country, which is to say, they have the instincts of a predator in this respect. China and the United States are to a considerable degree de-risking and deconflicting by withdrawing a bit the degree of economic interaction between the two countries, which is not surprising. What is going to happen over time is the political character of the relationship, that is to say, the extent to which there is not a lot of bilateral exposure, will increase. The degree of bilateral exposure of China in the U.S. market, of the United States in the Chinese market, is likely to decrease, whereas the capacity that the United States has to threaten those partners that are closest to it will not change. And so as a consequence, although there are relatively few actual conflicts between the United States and Canada, the incoming administration, nonetheless wants to use whatever leverage it has, to the point where just yesterday we were hearing Trump saying if the Canadians don't like that, they can become the 51st state. If anyone wants to read my chapter on Canada in my previous book on trade and American leadership, this is not the first time an American president or an American political leader has said that sort of thing. The Canadians, I think, are rather used to it by now. But yes, whoever posed that question, these are the most immediate and high-profile examples of conflict. They will not be the only ones.
Thank you, Craig. There's another question in the chat this time to address to Pierre Sauvé. If Pierre is still with us.
Yes, I'm still here.
Can you see the question on the chat?
Yes, I can. And the question is about whether the GATS provides complete rules for trade and services in relation to my last point about the limited degree of traction in the WTO on services. There is, of course, much more traction in addressing services in the context of bilateral and regional preferential agreements. That's really where the action on services has been, even though it's not been overwhelming there either. Countries have a much greater propensity to lock in the status quo rather than to liberalize trade and investment in services, and are even more cautious when it comes to liberalizing conditions governing the movement of people. But clearly the GATS rulebook is incomplete. It's incomplete at origin, still missing some important elements relating to disciplines on subsidies for services, which may be important if countries are going to approach the service sector more from a sort of industrial policy perspective for services, if you want. We don't have multilateral disciplines in the GATS on procurement for services, even though services are covered by the GPA. And we don't have disciplines on safeguard measures, which would be an interesting insurance policy that would entice probably more liberalization if you had the means to deploy a safeguard clause, but that's never been achieved. Now, on digital, clearly the rules are inadequate because when the GATS was created, digital trade, e-commerce, the internet did not exist. And so the agreement is largely silent on this issue. Some people would like to think that the agreement is technologically neutral. I think that really doesn't make much sense because the agreement was never about delivering services through remote means digitally. So we're going to need to negotiate the parameters under which digital trade occurs, and that's what's been attempted in plurilateral discussions at the WTO among a group of presumably like-minded countries. Developing country participation in that plurilateral negotiation is among the weakest of all the existing plurilateral negotiations at the WTO, which suggests, again, that a lot of developing countries are somewhat lukewarm or a bit fearful of the consequences of engaging prematurely in digital governance rulemaking. But then again, this is a bit paradoxical because these very same countries are deeply engaged in doing exactly that in their bilateral or regional, or in the context of Africa, in the continental context, and the AFCFTA, whose digital trade protocol largely mirrors what is at play in WTO discussions. So there's still work to do in completing the rule book, and that would help to stabilize and probably boost trade in what we know to be the most vibrant segment of world services trade. Services that are traded remotely have been rising and growing faster than more traditional forms of services trade. But we don't yet have globally a body of rules to underpin this trade. All we have is a series of preferential rules that are not always compatible because there are very strong differences across regions in the Americas, in Europe, in Asia under the Chinese model, very different approaches to some of the core issues of digital trade governance. So very much still work to be done in completing the rule book and also bringing countries back to the table in actually doing something about repealing what are still today relatively restrictive regimes on services. The barriers to trade and investment in services, and certainly barriers to the movement of people, remain very high in many countries and many sectors. And therefore, there is a very large liberalization agenda out there that remains to be tackled. But as Dirk was suggesting earlier, there is very much of a missing appetite for liberalization, certainly at the WTO level. Market access, market opening, liberalization have almost become dirty words in Geneva. And until and unless we're prepared to tackle impediments to trade and investment in services, it's going to be very difficult to leverage trade and investment for purposes of development. Let me stop there.
Thank you, Pierre. Craig, there's other questions in the chat. One for you, one for Vahini, and another one for Pierre.
Yes, I see. There is the question to me on what are the determinants of how hot the conflict becomes between the two great powers, and what are the best ways to deconflict, and could there be space for a new non-aligned movement? Actually, that relates to parts that I've just been writing the last few days, because the question arises, what's the immediate prospect or the midterm prospect for the relations between the United States and China? Certainly one possibility is what we'll be seeing is a practice of muddling through. I think that the atmosphere of U.S. relations with China will be very much like that between the United States and the Soviet Union during parts of the Cold War. But the question then became, how often would we have business as usual, and how often might we have crises? And the difference here being that there was only one dimension in which crises would occasionally erupt between the United States and the Soviet Union, and that was the military, because the Soviet Union was a disengaged power, economically speaking. To the extent that more countries trade largely with the United States or largely with China, a block system begins to develop. The question then becomes to what extent either or both the United States and China may force countries to choose sides. As Ty was suggesting, preferences start to matter more if tariffs begin to matter more, but that also means creating the leverage that may be used as either side when you become dependent upon your access to one of the major markets. Now, one issue not discussed so far is if you are in a developing country and you are faced with the question of to what extent do we wish to align ourselves with the United States or align ourselves with China or be non-aligned, the initial question is non-alignment going to be allowed by either of the parties, or are they going to be imposing tariffs and preferences in such a way as to make it more and more a matter of pressure on countries to decide which way they will go? In that event, one thing that I would like to stress for people is the qualitative difference in trade that developing countries have with China versus the United States, which is to say, qualitatively, the types of goods and services that are imported by the United States from developing countries are of a higher level than those that tend to be imported by China. China wants to import raw and semi-finished materials and export finished goods. The United States imports finished goods, especially consumer goods, but also some capital goods from developing countries. So you want to think not just about the raw numbers, but you want to think about the larger implications. I wish we didn't have to discuss this. I wish we were in a position where we were 10, 20 years ago, where countries were not forced to think about either or aspects of their trade relations with the major markets. But unfortunately, that is where we are today. And the prospects for being non-aligned, it was easier to be non-aligned militarily because not everyone had to be involved militarily than it is to be non-aligned economically, because to be a developing country is almost by definition to be more economically exposed. There are examples I can give you of developing countries that are relatively disengaged, for which exports do not account for very high shares of their domestic economy. That's true for Ethiopia, that's true for Pakistan and others. But for the most part, developing countries are very dependent on the external sector, and they may be facing some difficult choices in the years to come.
Thank you, Craig.
Go ahead.
There's another question to Vahini. Vahini, are you still with us?
Yes, I am.
Okay, great. So if you can read the question and answer, please.
Okay, so the question to me is, what is the benefit for developing countries in adhering to WTO rules when increasingly developed countries are flouting the rules as well? It's really bit of a difficult question. You know, the WTO is a rules-based organization. So it goes without saying that there has to be an adherence to the rules that are created in the WTO. And so, you know, with the rule-breaking behavior of a number of developed countries, it is increasingly going to pose a big challenge But I think overall, you know, it is in terms of the legal protections, access to the WTO dispute settlement system, you know, political solidarity, but also credibility for developing countries to adhere to rules. And of course, coupled with the WTO reform agenda, I think this adherence to rules in the WTO need to be accompanied by efforts to also reform the system and assert the rights of developing countries. So I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Vahini. And the last question for Pierre in the same series.
So what role do I see for the interim dispute settlement mechanism that's been created to uphold WTO rules among signatories? I think, you know, one needs to applaud the willingness of 47 of the 166 members to try to find an alternative way of settling disputes among each other. It's been relatively weakly used so far. It exists. But there are some very big players that are not playing by these rules. This includes the country that perhaps has shown and is currently projecting the greatest departures from normal WTO rule-based behavior. And so the fact that the United States is not a signatory of the MPIA and the fact that there is no appellate body right now essentially grants the United States complete immunity from prosecution at the WTO. And if indeed the Trump administration is to implement what it suggests it aims to implement, this would result in flouting a lot of its commitments at the WTO, would be contravening its legal obligations at the WTO. But there would be no effective means multilaterally to challenge this non-compliant conduct. And that is very troubling. And that really saps, I would say, fundamentally, the credibility of the multilateral trading system. And so, you know, bringing the ongoing discussions on reforming the WTO dispute settlement system, bringing everybody back into some multilateral tent of dispute resolution is extremely important. The aim was to do that before the end of this year. This is not going to happen. And how an incoming US administration is going to approach this topic is going to be extremely important in my view, and therefore difficult at this moment in time to speculate. So, you know, two answers: essentially applaud the willingness of countries to subject themselves to plurilateral dispute settlement under the MPIA, but at the same time bemoan the fact that some of the very large players and players with a known propensity to flout the rules are enjoying immunity from the current impasse in dispute settlement reform.
Thank you very much, Pierre. Are there any other questions? Seems like no. Okay. Maybe then we can close the webinar. Well, I'd like to thank all our speakers, Craig, Pierre, Dirk, Tai, for their participation today, their availability and time, and Vahini, sorry. Thank you very much to all of you. That was a very interesting discussion. We discussed many topics concerning trade policy issues. And thank you to all the participants for taking the time to join us. Thank you very much. And I just want to encourage our online course participants to continue progressing in the course, which has, I think, 10 more days to go, and then it will be closed before the Christmas holidays, that's for sure. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.